As you can see from the screen, we are continuing our Back to Basics on the sheet metal series. And just to do a quick recap of what we spoke about last time, we talked about most of the time the out-of-the-box setup will not work for what you need, so you're going to need to have to do some customization. And to help facilitate that, the goals of this series is hopefully going to give you the ability to work with the software and not against it, and to be able to set up your software so that you can create your models quicker and easier and fabricate correctly the first time. Again, we're not going to cover software installations or shop equipment setup, and we went over what you should have installed. I'm not going to go over that again today. And last time we talked about modeling an MEP system, and we spoke about adding equipment and then creating your connecting elements, which is what we was going to start on today, and annotating the models. And then we went through equipment and adding it and the different ways to add your equipment. And then I did a little demo inside of AutoCAD MEP. Now, since I put this presentation on last week and the things that we spoke about last week, I thought a little bit more about the entire scope of the presentation and what I should talk about. And when I got to equipment and what we spoke about last week, I thought that maybe I had jumped the gun on equipment just a little bit too soon. There was something I should have spoke about first, and that is spaces and ceiling grids. And it's something that in the fabrication world here at East Coast we don't talk about very much, we don't use very much, but I thought it was important enough to speak about quickly, not spend a lot of time on it, but just to throw it out there to show you the possibilities, what it can do, and the benefits that it will allow you in your drawings. And generally, spaces and ceiling grids would be something that you would set up before you would start to place your equipment. So it should have been spoken about before we talked about equipment, but it is what it is, so we'll speak about it now. So spaces in AutoCAD MEP. What are spaces? Spaces are a physical representation of rooms and areas in a building. They are 100% optional. If you don't want to do spaces in your fabrication drawings, you don't need to. It's not going to hurt anything at all. They can be either 2D or 3D. It's your choice. They hold the same information, but it's just what you'll see on the screen. Different uses that they might have. And let me back up a second. Whether they're 2D or 3D will actually 2D versions allow you to do one subset of uses, and a 3D version allows you to do another subset. If you're doing load calculations, I believe that you need to have the 3D version of spaces, just because it will take into account the area of your windows, your doors, that sort of thing, that you will not get in a 2D representation of the space. So the uses, load calculations, obviously. You can automatically, using third-party software, something such as Trace or Autodesk has some online versions of the software. You can calculate loads in your designs if you're actually doing some designing. There are some fabrication companies that do design build type stuff, and they do need to calculate loads. This software will help facilitate that. An excellent use of spaces is for little helper methods inside your property sets. They hold the room names for easy tagging. A super important thing is the automatic generation of equipment locations. So if you place a VAV box inside of a space, it automatically knows it's in that space. If you've given the correct name to the space, that space name can then appear in a schedule next to the VAV box, so you know right what room it's going in. If you happen to move the VAV box around during the course of coordination, the VAV box will immediately know that it's left a certain space and it is now in a different space, and the name and everything will update accordingly. There's possibilities of having automatic offsets for your elevations. So if you're all of a sudden you come into a computer room and the floor is now 2 feet lower than the rest of the level, if you set everything up in your property sets correctly, your duct can automatically understand that it now needs to add 2 feet to its elevation. We currently have something similar to that in the software, but you have to manually put in the offset. If you were to use spaces, then it is 100% possible for that piece of duct to recognize that it's in this space, and the space is actually 2 feet lower than the surrounding spaces, so it needs to add that elevation to the elevation of the duct. Spaces hold ceiling information and ceiling elevations, so as a duct comes into a space, it knows whether it can be above or below the ceiling, or above and below the slab, because the space also holds a top elevation, and you can utilize that information in your tags if you want to. So if you go to place an elevation tag and the duct is below the ceiling elevation, instead of reporting the elevation, we can set up the property sets to it to where instead it reports that it is below the ceiling, or any elevation that you represent to be the ceiling. And what I mean by that is, say you have a ceiling elevation of 9 feet and you want everything to be above 6 inches above that ceiling. Well, then you can represent the minimum elevation to be the ceiling elevation plus that 6 inches. And anything that goes into that no-fly zone, so to speak, you could then call out in a tag. So as soon as you tag your duct, instead of calling out the elevation, it could call out that it's below the ceiling. Lots of great uses for spaces. So let's take a look at them real quick inside of our software. And what I did here was I just added some polylines to represent some rooms in blank model space, which you would normally have a CAD background that you would use. So just like anything in AutoCAD MEP, when you want to add it to model space, it's the name of the object plus the add command. So you have the duct add command, the duct fitting add command. So for a space, you would have the space add command. So I just type space add, and I get a representation of a space. I can place it anywhere inside of this polygon. Then I can just stretch the object out to where it needs to be to fully encompass the sides of that room, if these each represent a room. If we look at this space, we can see that it is a 3D version. I can come in here and I can set the overall space height, and that would be from top of slab to the bottom of the slab above. I can set the ceiling height elevation, floor thickness, ceiling thickness, things like that. Some things you might want and use, other things you might not. So you notice right now that this is a 3D representation of space. I can come up here on the property palette where it says geometry type. I can change this drop down from extrusion to 2D. You can see right away that it changes what it looks like in the drawing, and when you come over here you see that it is just, it's removed some options from that property palette. So you're really only getting your length and your width and your area out of that space. So when you're in a 2D space, you don't really get your ceiling and your top of slab elevations. So let's go ahead and change that back to an extrusion and turn it back here. And I use the space add command to add that space. There's other ways of doing it. If I switch my workspace to the architectural workspace, and I just do that to where I get easy access to the architectural tool palette, I can come on the Design tab and click my space, and it's this tool here will automatically generate spaces based on closed objects in your drawing, or if you happen to have, you're lucky enough to have an architectural drawing that has walls, slabs, windows, doors, that sort of thing, spaces will automatically be generated based on the outlines of the walls and doors. We don't have that. So what this is saying is that there's nothing in this drawing that forms a valid boundary to put a space in. And it's saying, do you want to use all visible objects to bound spaces? Yes or no? In this case, I am just going to close it right now and say no, because I want to show you something. Whenever you select the poly line inside of AutoCAD MEP and you come over to the property palette, way down here at the bottom there's something called bound spaces, and it's a yes or no property. If I change that to yes, that means that these poly lines will now set the boundary for a space. For these strictly rectangular spaces, maybe not a big deal because you saw it was very easy to stretch and grab it to where it needs to go. But for other types of spaces, irregular shapes, I can use this space tool again. And what it did was it scanned the drawing. Now it's just asking me to pick an internal point. And you can see as I hover over these poly lines that it's highlighting where the space would be. So I'm just going to pick some points real quick and have them go in there. And it just automatically generated those spaces for you. Pretty cool if you have a drawing that has the closed poly lines already in there. It makes generating these spaces really quick. If you select a space and go to the property palette, you can give it a name. It automatically generates a name for you, but you can also give it a name, which that name is now accessible through a property set. So spaces are really cool, and like I said, when you run a duct or a piece of equipment through a space, if you attach a space location-based property set to your object, it will automatically then know which space it is in. So as things that I mentioned before, it just makes for a lot of really cool automation that you can do. The last thing down here, a use for a space. It can be used as a container for a ceiling grid. And so that brings us to our next object, which is a ceiling grid. A ceiling grid is very useful for placing ceiling components, most importantly air terminals. A grid placed in a space will automatically adhere to the ceiling elevation. So as I've shown you on the property palette, spaces have a property that represents the ceiling elevation. When you place a ceiling grid into a space, it will automatically snap to that ceiling elevation. If you change the elevation of the space, the elevation of the ceiling grid will change with it. Components that are anchored to the ceiling grid will move with the grid. So if you place an air terminal into the ceiling grid and you anchor it, and then for whatever reason that ceiling has to move during coordination, maybe there's not enough room between the slab and the ceiling, so you have to tell the architect you need to lower it. If you have a space and a ceiling grid in that space and your air terminals are anchored to the grid, it's as simple as coming in and selecting the space, changing the ceiling elevation. The air terminals will drop down with the ceiling grid, and the flex ducts will stay connected to the air terminals, and everything will move where it needs to be. Just a couple seconds to upgrade your ceiling elevations. If you're using tags in your drawing to tag your ceiling elevation instead of text, then that tag will update immediately to report the correct elevation. Ceiling grids have the ability to contain holes. So if you have a elevated drop ceiling with a, I don't know the correct term, but with a gypsum board center, you can certainly create that with the ceiling grid tool. One of the downsides of the ceiling grid is it only has the grid look and feel. You cannot change it to look like gypsum board. So let's real quick just look at adding a ceiling grid to our drawing, and I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the HVAC workspace. And just like the space add command, if we want to add a ceiling grid, we just type in the ceiling grid add command. Very simple. So we see what we get. We get a rectangular object, and if we look at the command line, what I like to do first is go ahead and select this set boundary on the command line. I can do the same thing on the property palette by where it says boundary, choose, say, select object. And as soon as I change that, the command line is going to tell me to select a space or a closed polyline for a boundary. So what that means is, obviously I select a space, but it also means I can select this polyline, and we can place a ceiling grid without a space if we so want to do. So let's go ahead and place this grid object right inside of here. So I'm going to select it. Now it's going to ask me to set a location, and again at the command line I'm just going to say snap to center and then give it a rotation of 0. So if I zoom in here, let me hit the cancel out of the command, and let me go ahead and select spaces, right click on it, and go to Edit Object Display, and then a plan screen view. What I want to do is I want to turn off the hatch. I don't want to see the hatch anymore in our display, and I can see that it is perfectly centered into this space. If I go to a 3D view, I can see that it did not snap to the ceiling elevation, but if I look at the ceiling elevation and hit 9 feet, it did pop up there that time. So when I placed it, it didn't actually place at the ceiling like it should have. That was probably something that I did wrong. But if you notice, I come back here and change to 8 feet, that grid will pop up and down exactly where it needs to go. I don't want to spend too much time on the ceiling grid, but just to look at placing it inside a polyline instead of a space. So if I go ahead and choose the grid add again, and let's say I place it here, then once I place it, I can come up and I can select the boundary, select the object, and that will go ahead and clip that space, and then I can move it to where I need to be, and you can see that it will stretch and grow exactly as needed. Once I've set it in that space, I need to come in and set an elevation. In this case, I'll set it to 9 feet. And you can see that it works and lives just fine without the space object on it. So now that we have those objects in our drawing, let's place some parts on there and get to the meat of what we really want to look at. So let's go to the MV part add command. Let's just choose a diffuser to place in here. I'm going to go ahead and place it right here, and then look at that in 3D. You can see that it did place on the grid. If I choose this space object and change the ceiling elevation to 9 feet, we can see that unfortunately the air terminal did not move with it. So if we go back to 8 feet, we can see that it's now back to the elevation of the ceiling grid. So how do we fix that? What do we need to do? And let me switch right on back to my PowerPoint, because I actually have a slide on this. And this is where we want to talk about anchors. In AutoCAD MEP, there are 9 different types of anchors. I am not going to go over all of them. What I'm going to go over today is the most versatile one, which is the object anchor. What the object anchor does is it attaches one or more AEC objects to another AEC object, allowing the first object to move in relation to the other. In other words, if we take the air terminal and we anchor it to the grid, when the grid moves, the air terminal will move with it. Now the anchors are only work in one way. So if I move the air terminal, the grid is not going to move with it, because the grid is not anchored to the air terminal. The air terminal is anchored to the grid. You can place an object anchor by using the object anchor attach command, and it'll just start the process to anchor your air terminal to your ceiling grid. Another method is to go ahead and open up the stock tool catalog in the content browser, and as you can see here, I have it highlighted. You can take this object anchor tool and click and drag it onto your tool palette, and then you'll have a ready-made tool to start the object anchor command. Coincidentally, you can do that same thing with any command that you want. So you could copy that object anchor tool, rename it, and give it any command name that you want. And we'll go over that in just a few minutes. Some possible uses of the anchors. I just spoke about anchoring an air terminal to a ceiling grid. Another use would be anchoring an exhaust fan or an air handling unit to a roof curb. You move the curb, the piece of equipment will move with it. Now, one thing to realize and understand about that is these anchors only work with AEC objects. So if your roof curb is a 3D solid, it's not going to work. It has to be an MV part or an MV block in order for the fan or air handling unit to anchor to it. You can anchor an air handling unit to a concrete pad. And again, the concrete pad must be an AEC object. It could be the architectural slabs. You can create a slab out of an MV part or even out of an MV block. The most important thing to note about that is it has to be an AEC object. So let's look at that. First, let's go ahead and get our tool from our stock tool catalog and drag it onto our tool palette. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring it on into my equipment tool palette right up under my mechanical equipment. So our tool palettes are located in our content browser, which is on the home ribbon. I select content browser. It pops it up. I like to go to the top bar and go ahead and select always on top. That way when I select AutoCAD like I did there, you can see that that dialog goes away. But if I have that selected, when I select AutoCAD, that dialog does not go away. It's useful for dragging and dropping items to and from your tool catalog. Let's find the stock tool catalog. This is not the MEP stock tool catalog, but just the regular old stock tool catalog. So I'll select it, and then there is a tab on here for parametric layout and anchoring tools. I'll go ahead and select that, and then we can see we have the object anchor. I will go ahead and click the eyedropper and drag it onto my palette, and I'm going to place it up here right underneath mechanical equipment. And we can see, there we go, we now have that. And I can safely close out of my content browser. But let's go ahead, before we use it, let's right click and go to its properties. And we can see what this is really, it's just a command tool. It has a name, and it's starting up a command. That's it. All this tool is doing is starting up the AEC object anchor attach command. I could very easily come over here, right click on this, copy and paste, and went down to the bottom. So let me drag it up, then go to these properties of it again. Instead of calling it object anchor, I'm going to call it duct fitting add. Then down here at the bottom, I'm going to change this command to be AEC B, or actually I can just say duct fitting add. The --C, all of that does is simulate hitting the escape key twice. So if you're in the middle of a command and you press this button on the tool palette, it'll escape out of the current command. So I hit OK, OK. I come over here and then select this. You can see that it just starts the duct fitting add command for me. So nice, quick, slick way to get any command that you want on the tool palette. So object anchor attach. Let's start that. When I select it, you can see at the command line it's saying select the objects to be anchored. I want to anchor this air terminal, and then I want to anchor it to the ceiling grid. So now that I've done that, I come in here, I select the space, and now when I change the elevation of this ceiling, you can see that that ceiling grid moves right along with it. Very powerful. If you take the time to set this up, it allows for a lot of changes during the coordination process. As I said when it first started, you know, it's a little iffy on whether or not fabrication contractors really need this. Maybe by the time they get to it, the ceilings are not really changing that much, so they might not really need to use it. They might change, you know, maybe in 5 rooms throughout the entire project. If you happen to be doing design build and using this, well then the ceilings can change heights a lot throughout the entire life of your project. So this could be of great benefit to you. So that was my quick aside that I wanted to talk about ceilings and spaces. There's a lot more information on them. If you're interested, if you just go into the help file, F1 on the AutoCAD MEP keyboard, just type in space, and you'll get a whole bunch of information in here about spaces, space styles, all of that sort of thing. The setup of your drawings and of your software will make all the difference in the world when it comes to routing your duct quickly and easily. So are there any questions?
Hey, Keith. Hey, listen, I just had a question about the spaces. What happens, or how do you do it, or create a space that, you know, not like a cube? Maybe it has a dome roof or something like that, or a dome ceiling. How would you go about doing that? You know, because that was an issue I had before with importing a space, you know, into train trace with a dome shaped space. So, do you have any idea?
Yes. So when I selected the space and we said geometry type, we looked at extrusion and we looked at 2D. What we did not look at was freeform, and that's the type of space that you would use, and it would allow you to configure that space to what you needed to do. If I copy this one out here in the open and just choose freeform, I would probably need to read up on it a little bit, but I'm pretty sure that that allows you to create it in any manner that you want. And it's probably something where you can create the geometry as a 3D solid, then apply that space to that 3D solid.
Yeah, my question was, for those spaces, can I use that same function for VAV service area or service, you know, access?
Yes, you can, if you wanted to. Are you probably just wanting to get the look and feel of that space? And I turned off the hatching for this, so let's go ahead and turn that back on. So is this probably the look that you're looking for the space? Is that
yes, I was looking for something similar to that. The other question I had was regarding the same, in reference to the same question is, can I use that, or can I tag it with that, like an elevation or anything like that?
Yes. Yes and yes. You can use this for access space. I believe if you talk to Steven, I think he probably has a better solution for you. But this is certainly usable as access space. And because it is an AEC object, and your VAV boxes, if you've created them as multi-view parts, they are AEC objects. You can also anchor this to your VAV box so that it will move and rotate with your box. As far as tags go, yes, you can create tags for this. So if we give this a room name, I'll just call it Mechanical Room 2. And then let's look at our data, see if we have a property set for spaces. We don't have a property set ready to go for spaces, but just take my word for it. If we create a property set, we set it to where it works for spaces, and then we can go in there, and as an automatic property of that property set, we can say grab the room name. It'll grab that room name. It'll also grab any of the other properties of the space with some extra tricks. The elevation you can certainly get in a property set. It's not as straightforward. You have to do a couple little tricks to get there. If you guys are really interested in doing that, then we can set something up outside of this forum, and I can show you how to do that. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.